if a single silent decision could change the destiny of an entire people. In today's video, you'll discover the story of a choice that seemed impossible, and that could cost a life. Wait and see how a decision made in silence changed the course of history. Stay tuned, because perhaps you too are facing a moment like this. Don't miss it, because this story could change the way you approach decisions in your own life. For many years, the palace of Susa breathed like a silent creature made of stone, power, and fear. Its wide corridors held secrets that no one dared repeat aloud. And each step echoed like a warning that in that place, even the smallest decisions could become the fate of thousands of people. The Persian Empire was gigantic. Its territory stretched across distant lands, diverse peoples, and cultures that would never have imagined having anything in common. But inside the palace, everything seemed smaller and more suffocating, as if the weight of power compressed the air and transformed every conversation into something dangerous. Inside, no one spoke louder than they should. Servants walked with short steps, guards kept a watchful eye, and the king's advisors chose each word carefully. It wasn't just respect for the throne, it was fear, because in that place, there was a rule that everyone knew. No one could enter the king's presence without being summoned. It didn't matter who it was. The law was simple, and so was the consequence. Anyone who crossed those doors without authorization could die. There was no discussion. There was no explanation. Only the king's decision, made at that moment, in front of everyone. And on that day, someone was about to defy that rule. He was not a powerful general. He was not an influential advisor, not even a man accustomed to vying for power within the palace. She was a woman. Her name was Esther. But at that time, her name was not yet known for what it would one day represent. To many, she was simply the queen. To others, just another figure within the complex structures of the palace. But there was something that almost no one knew. Esther carried a secret that, if revealed at the wrong time, could turn her life into a sentence. A secret that connected her destiny to the destiny of an entire people scattered throughout the empire. Outside the palace, the city of Susa continued its routine. Merchants closed their stalls, animals were driven through the dirt streets, and the sun slowly disappeared behind the ancient walls. But within those walls, something was about to happen. A decree had been signed. A document sealed with imperial authority. A cold decision, written with ink and power. And that decision stated that an entire people should disappear. Men, women, children, all. Not because of a war, not because of a rebellion, but because of the pride of a man who had turned his own anger into politics. As the news began to spread, fear swept through the communities like an icy wind bursting through open doors. People who had been living their routines began to realize that their lives were now marked by a decision made far away. It was as if the future had been written without them knowing. And in a way, it had been. But at that moment, and almost no one imagined that within the palace itself, there was someone who could change that story. Someone who carried two identities. One known for its empire, another one hidden in the silence of the heart. And now, for the first time, these two lives were about to intersect. Because Esther had received a message that changed everything. A message that offered no comfort. It didn't offer easy solutions. He had only one question. A question that spans generations and continues to appear in the lives of many people to this day. What do you do when you realize that you may have been placed in exactly a certain position to face a moment that no one else can face? That night, Esther had to decide to remain silent or risk their own life. Because sometimes the most important moment in our history doesn't arrive with applause. He arrives silently. And when that moment arrives, there's a decision that no one can make for you. The messenger arrived covered in dust from the road, carrying in his hands a torn piece of cloth that served as an improvised pouch for letters and decrees. And when he stopped before Mordecai in the square near the gate of the palace of Susa, the noise of the city seemed to suddenly diminish, as if the very air had sensed that something too heavy was about to fall upon those who lived there. Mordecai held the still-sealed parchment for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the imperial wax between his fingers, because in that seal there was not only ink and authority, but also the destiny of people he knew by name, faces that walked the same streets, children who still played among the market stalls. When the seal finally broke, the dry sound of the wax cracking seemed too loud for such a small gesture. And as Mordecai's eyes scanned the written lines with the coldness of someone who had never set foot on those streets, the blood began to slowly drain from his face, as if each word took away a little of the life that still remained there. The decree was clear, and its clarity was precisely what made it all the more terrible, because there was no metaphor, no room for interpretation, only the order that on a specific day all Jews scattered throughout the empire should be eliminated, through their possessions seized, their homes invaded, their stories erased as if they had never existed. The square began to fill with murmurs as other men received copies of the same decree, and the sound of voices mingled with the muffled sobs of women trying to understand how an entire life could be condemned by a distant signature, written by someone who had never seen their faces or heard their names. Mordecai remained motionless for a few moments, holding the open parchment, while the afternoon dust slowly settled on his shoulders and the sunlight began to lean against the palace walls, casting long shadows that seemed to announce a dark time approaching. It was then that he tore his own clothes, not with the violence of someone seeking attention, but with the heavy gesture of someone who had just understood that the world he knew had just been torn into two irreconcilable parts. Again, and the old fabric yielded under his fingers, while the dry sound of the tearing echoed among the stones of the square. He spread ash over his head, and that mixture of dust and sweat began to slowly trickle down his face, forming marks that seemed too old to belong only to that day, as if a collective pain had finally found a body in which to manifest itself. The sob that escaped his chest was neither loud nor theatrical, but deep and drawn out, a sound that seemed to come from a place far older than the decree itself. And people passing through the palace gate began to stop when they saw him sitting on the ground, covered in dust, holding the scroll that now trembled in his hands. Some approached silently, others merely watched from afar, because everyone knew that this kind of lament only appeared when something too great had broken within the history of a people. Inside the palace, however, the routine continued as if the world outside had not just received a sentence, and the corridors were still filled with the sweet smell of wine and spices, while servants walked carrying bronze trays that reflected the light of the torches. Esther did not yet know what was happening in the streets of Susa, but she felt that something invisible was moving around her, because there are moments when the silence inside a palace begins to weigh more than the noise of a crowd. When one of her servants rushed into the room, bringing confused news about a man dressed in rough cloth who was weeping before the king's gate, Esther rose slowly, trying to comprehend how someone could allow themselves such despair so close to the palace walls, where every gesture was observed by eyes trained to punish any sign of instability. Mordecai's name was then whispered, and for a moment her heart seemed to forget its normal rhythm, because that name wasn't just that of a distant acquaintance. It was the man who had raised her when she was still a girl, trying to understand her place in the world. A message was discreetly sent to the palace gate, asking Mordecai to explain the reason for his grief. And when the reply returned in the hands of a servant, the weight of the decree pierced those stone walls like an invisible blade. The scroll was placed before Esther, and as her eyes scanned each line, the silence of the room became too thick to breathe. Because at that moment, she understood that the threat written there was not only against a distant people scattered throughout the empire. He was against her too. Because behind the crown, behind the embroidered fabrics and the perfume of the palace, Esther still carried an identity that no one there knew. And now that identity had become a sentence. Mordecai then sent another message, shorter, more weighty, as if each word had been chosen after traversing an entire field of mixed fear and hope. And when that message reached Esther, she realized that she was no longer facing a political problem or a distant injustice. She was facing a decision that no one inside that palace could make for her. Because sometimes the place we've been put in stops being just a privilege and starts to look like a responsibility that could cost us everything. The sun had already set low enough that the shadows of the palace began to lengthen across Susa Square. And I can imagine the weight of that twilight slowly falling on Mordecai's shoulders as he sat by the king's gate. The rough cloth clinging to his sweaty skin and the smell of ash mingling with the hot air coming from the streets. Because that place was not just an entrance to the palace, it was also the point where the destinies of the powerful intersected, often unknowingly, with the fragile lives of those who had no voice. People kept passing by him, some averting their gaze so as not to be immersed in the pain that flowed from his hunched posture. Others pausing for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher whether that lamenting man was carrying a personal loss or a greater tragedy. And few knew that in his hands lay a decree that transformed the future of an entire people into a calendar of waiting for their own destruction. Something too cold to fit within a human mind without the heart beginning to fail along the way. Inside the palace, however, life continued at a different pace, as if two worlds were separated by those stone walls. Servants continued cleaning the polished floors of the corridors. Guards kept their spears resting on the cold marble. And the king's advisors spoke in hushed voices about matters that seemed important only to those whose existence had never been threatened by a distant signature. And in the midst of this disciplined silence, Esther held the scroll that had reached her through cautious messengers, rereading the lines that now seemed to burn within her mind. It was strange to realize how a few words could completely alter the weight of her own breath. Because until that moment, her life inside the palace had been a succession of carefully controlled days, where every gesture was guided by ancient rules and every conversation took place within invisible limits. And there was comfort in that control, a kind of silent security that allowed her to forget, at least for a few hours, that the world outside was much larger and more unpredictable. Now this world had passed through the palace gates, and there was no way to pretend he wasn't there. Mordecai's message was clear, but it carried a layer that no ink could fully capture. Because behind the words was a plea that could only be understood by someone who knew the price of carrying two identities within the same body. He reminded Esther of something she may have tried to keep dormant since the day she entered that place. The fact that her position there was never just a comfortable coincidence of life. Some events seem to occur by chance, but as time passes, they begin to reveal a kind of invisible direction, as if history were being slowly pushed towards a point where someone will need to decide whether to continue living, like it can only to preserve their own safety or to accept walking towards something much greater than mere survival. Esther sat for a long time without calling any of her servants. letting the silence of the room become heavy enough for each thought to find its place. Because there are decisions that cannot be made in the presence of many voices. The scent of the slowly burning oil lamps filled the air, and the distant sound of guards patrolling the corridors reminded her that the palace continued to function as always. But something inside her had begun to change. She knew the palace law better than anyone who lived outside those walls, because she had learned early on that access to the king was not a matter of closeness or affection, but of permission, and the rule was known to all who breathed within that empire. Whoever entered the king's presence without being summoned placed their own life in the hands of a single gesture. If the golden scepter were extended, there would be life. If the scepter remained still, death ensued. It was that simple. And at that moment, Esther realized that Mordecai wasn't just asking her to speak to the king. He was asking her to voluntarily walk into a situation where the outcome could be her own execution. When the idea hung in the air like an invisible blade as she closed her eyes for a few moments. Because even brave people need a few seconds to admit that fear reached their hearts first. Outside, Mordecai continued to wait. He couldn't cross the palace gate dressed in mourning clothes, and perhaps he didn't even want to go in, because there were times when remaining outside was the only way to remind those protected by the walls that reality still existed. The evening wind began to blow slowly through the streets of Susa, raising small swirls of dust that danced in the dim light of the torches. And at that very moment, Esther opened her eyes again, realizing that the quiet life she had learned to accept within the palace might be coming to an end. Because some doors remain closed for years, until the day someone understands that they need to cross them anyway. Night had fallen over Susa, and the torches fastened to the palace walls cast a flickering light that made the shadows seem alive, moving slowly across the ancient stones as if the building itself breathed along with those who inhabited its corridors. I can still imagine Esther sitting in that silent room, the scroll open on the low table, while the warm scent of the oil burning in the lamps began to mingle with the weight of the decisions that could no longer be postponed. Some choices come to us like an unexpected visitor, knocking on the door so suddenly that the first reaction is to pretend no one is home, as if silence could make the problem disappear. But there are decisions that remain there, waiting patiently until the person understands that there is no longer room to ignore what needs to be faced. Esther knew exactly what the risk was. Palace law was not merely a formality written on ancient scrolls guarded by the king's scribes, that it was reinforced daily by the memory of people who had disappeared after crossing boundaries too invisible to question. The king's throne was surrounded by a reverence that blended power, fear, and tradition, and no one dared approach it without being summoned, not even the queen. Therefore, the first reply that Esther sent to Mordecai was cautious, almost like someone trying to buy time before a path that seems too dangerous to travel. The message left the palace in the hands of a trusted servant, passed through corridors guarded by soldiers, and arrived again at the gate where Mordecai still remained dressed in his mourning clothes, sitting on the dust of the square, which was now illuminated only by the irregular light of the torches. Esther's words were simple, but full of reality. She explained that it had been many days since she had been summoned to the king's presence, and within that system of silent power, and this meant something very clear. Approaching the throne uninvited could transform a plea for help into a final sentence. The risk was not imaginary, nor exaggerated by the anxiety of someone afraid to act. It was a known rule, repeated, respected by all who wanted to remain alive within those walls. When Mordecai heard the reply, the night wind stirred up small particles of ash that still clung to the torn fabric of his robes. And for a few seconds, he stood motionless, gazing at the distant light emanating from the upper windows of the palace. Inside was the only person with access to the king, who also bore the same identity that was now threatened by the decree. And time was running out. The reply he sent back was not delicate. Some messages need to pierce someone's heart like a firm blow, because gentleness would be interpreted as just another comfortable excuse to remain still. The servant who carried Mordecai's words walked again through the silent corridors of the palace until he reached Esther's chamber, where the night had already advanced enough for the dark sky to be visible through the high openings in the walls. When Esther received that new message, the weight of the words seemed unlike anything she had heard that day. Mordecai remembered something that perhaps had never been said so directly before. Living within the palace did not mean being beyond the reach of the decree. If silence prevailed, if she chose to protect only her own safety, the truth could still come to light at the most unexpected moment. And the same sentence that threatened her people could also reach her own life. The comfort of the palace was no guarantee. It was just a break. And then came the phrase that would transcend the centuries as a silent question for all who would one day find themselves facing similar decisions. Perhaps you've arrived at this position precisely for a moment like this. When those words were read, the room seemed to shrink around Esther, as if the stone walls had moved a few steps closer, reducing the space between her and the reality that now demanded an answer. For years, her life had been guided by circumstances that seemed greater than her choices. Events that had led her from a simple childhood to the most protected place in the empire. Now that sequence of events was beginning to seem less random. Perhaps there was a hidden purpose within all of that. Perhaps the path that led her to the throne was not merely an accident of history, but understanding that possibility was very different from accepting the price that might come with it. Because recognizing a purpose almost always means admitting that current comfort may need to be sacrificed. And that night, Esther realized that the question before her was neither merely political nor merely familial. It was spiritual. What does someone do when they begin to suspect that their own life has been placed in a specific position to face a moment that no one else can face? If this silent decision of Esther is finding a place within you, perhaps it's because we all, and at some point in our lives, face a moment when we need to choose between security and purpose. If this reflection has guided you this far, leave your sign of support and join us on this journey. And if you want, just write these words in the comments. I choose courage. The silence that filled Esther's room after reading those words was not the kind of silence that brings rest. It was heavy, full of thoughts that seemed to move slowly within her mind, on us like cautious steps traversing terrain full of invisible traps. The flame of the oil lamp flickered slightly beside the low table, and its golden light made the parchment seem even older, as if those words belonged not only to that night, but to a much larger sequence of events that were now beginning to unfold before her. I imagine Esther rising slowly, walking a few steps across the room while the heavy fabric of her garments trailed gently on the stone floor, trying to find within herself some way to organize what she had just heard. The idea that her entire life could have been led to that specific point seemed too great to accept, but all at once. Like when someone realizes that past events were silently preparing a moment that only now begins to make sense. Outside the palace walls, the Jewish people scattered throughout the streets of Susa were already beginning to react to the announced decree, and in small groups gathered on street corners and in courtyards to try to understand what that announcement meant for their families. Fear has a peculiar way of spreading among people. It doesn't need to run. It doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs to cross a few whispered conversations, and suddenly everyone begins to feel that something fragile within daily life has just broken. Mordecai remained near the palace gate, and the cold night began to replace the warmth of the day as he stood there, like someone who had decided to occupy that place until the story found an answer. Some people passed by him bringing water or a piece of bread. Others only briefly touched his shoulder before continuing on their way, because even those who had no words understood that this man was carrying a pain that belonged to everyone. Inside the room, Esther finally stopped before the table again and rested her hands on the wooden surface, bowing her head for a few moments as her breathing slowed. There are times when the soul needs silence to recognize the magnitude of what lies before it. And that night, the silence seemed more genuine than any advice anyone could offer. It was then that she made a decision different from the one that had been suggested by her initial reaction of fear. Instead of immediately responding with another justification or seeking a safer way to deal with the situation, Esther sent a new message to Mordecai. And this time, her words carried a different weight, a kind of firmness that arises when someone finally accepts to look directly at the risk before them. The servant crossed the torchlit corridors again and left the palace through the same narrow passage used by messengers, then walking across the square until he found Mordecai still sitting by the gate. The dust of the night had already settled on the stones of the ground, and the air was colder than it had been a few hours before. When Mordecai received the reply, he realized that something had changed. Esther asked all the Jews in Susa to gather and fast for 3 days and 3 nights without food or water, and that she and her servants would do the same inside the palace. It wasn't just a religious gesture. It was an inner preparation, a recognition that there are moments in life when the strength needed to act comes not only from human courage, but from something deeper that needs to be sought in silence. As Mordecai listened to those words, the morning breeze began to gently stir the rough fabric of his garments. And for the first time since the decree had been announced, something resembling hope began to appear in his weary eyes. Inside the palace, Esther remained silent after sending the message, because she had reached the point where the decision had already been made. Even if the outcome was still completely hidden in the future. And it was then that she uttered words that carried the simplicity of someone who had already accepted the risk. "If I have to die, I will die." It wasn't a dramatic phrase said to impress someone, and it was merely the sound of a soul that had finally decided that some lives are preserved only when someone accepts walking into danger. Dawn was slowly advancing over Susa, and the dark sky seemed heavier than on ordinary nights, as if the city itself were trying to comprehend what had been decreed against those who still slept, unaware that their names were now part of a sentence written far from their homes. The streets were quieter than usual, and only the distant sound of occasional footsteps broke the stillness that spread among the stone buildings warmed by the heat of the previous day. Near the palace gate, Mordecai was still awake as the night wore on, leaning against the rough wall that separated the world of the powerful from the ordinary life that pulsed outside. The coarse cloth of his robes absorbed the chill of the early morning, and the dust that still covered his shoulders now seemed a natural part of his body, almost as if he had chosen to remain there until some answer emerged between the silent sky and the human decisions that seemed to be heading in such different directions. Messengers began to discreetly go out into the city streets, carrying the guidance that Esther had sent. And little by little, the Jewish families of Susa began to understand that this was not just a moment of collective fear, but a call to something deeper. Doors were closed before sunrise, and inside the houses, people began to gather in silence, setting aside their morning bread and daily songs, replacing everything with a kind of stillness that only appears when the soul decides to seek help beyond its own strength. Meanwhile, inside the palace walls, the atmosphere seemed strangely detached from the invisible activity happening throughout the city. The corridors remained lit by oil lamps, and guards changed positions with the usual discipline of those who follow orders without questioning the reason for the changes in the air around them. However, in the Queen's chamber, the atmosphere was completely different from the rest of the palace. Esther had removed the heavy ornaments she usually wore before the court, and her servants were also silent, observing the fast she had decided to begin. The table that normally held fresh fruit and soft bread remained empty, and the sound of the quiet breathing of some women kneeling on the floor created an atmosphere of waiting that seemed suspended between human time and something greater that could not yet be seen. The first day passed slowly. The second day seemed even longer. During this time, her body began to feel the lack of food, and each movement required more energy than on ordinary mornings. But curiously, while her physical strength diminished, something within Esther seemed to gain clarity, as if the prolonged silence was removing layers of fear that had previously occupied too much space in her mind. There are times when faith is not expressed in grand words or heroic gestures. It appears in small choices, repeated in silence, while someone continues to move forward, even when the outcome remains completely invisible. On the third day, as the sun began to rise over Susa, and the golden light slowly streamed through the high windows of the palace, Queen Esther rose from the place where she had spent much of the night in silent prayer. Her servants helped prepare the royal robes once more, adjusting the embroidered fabric that reflected the morning light, placing upon her head the crown that symbolized a position of authority that now seemed to carry a much heavier meaning. Every detail of that preparation seemed to carry a question that no one dared to ask, because on that day Esther would be stepping onto a path that offered no guarantee of return. The palace corridors were beginning to fill with movement again when she finally emerged from her chamber, and the soft sound of her sandals touching the polished floor echoed faintly between the tall columns that supported the building's ceiling. Guards passed her with silent reverence. Servants stepped aside to make way, and no one seemed to realize that this simple walk was about to become one of the most dangerous decisions ever made within those walls. Ahead of her was the throne room, and between her and that place, there was only one thing. To her, the corridor leading to the throne room seemed longer that morning than on any other day, as if the palace stones had decided to lengthen the distance between Esther and the moment that was now inevitably approaching. I can imagine the firm, yet restrained, sound of her footsteps touching the polished floor as sunlight streamed through the high openings in the walls, creating golden streaks that pierced the air, thick with fine suspended dust. Some servants passed by her carrying trays and fabrics, and upon noticing the Queen's presence, they slightly inclined their heads, following the silent protocol that organized every movement within that place. None of them knew what was about to happen, and perhaps it was better that way, because there are decisions that need to be made without the added weight of many people's gaze. As Esther advanced, the space began to open before her, revealing the entrance to the great hall where the king used to receive governors, emissaries, and advisors from different parts of the empire. Tall columns supported the ornate ceiling, and heavy tapestries hung from the walls depicting scenes of ancient battles and conquests that had expanded the borders of Persia into distant territories. And in the center of that space was the throne, and the king sat on the throne. Ahasuerus sat with the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to occupying that place without challenge, while some men conversed near the steps leading up to him. The morning light touched the gold of the scepter that rested in his hand, and the metal reflected small points of gleam that moved slightly as he adjusted his fingers around the shaft. Esther paused for a brief moment before crossing the threshold of the hall. It was not a gesture of hesitation, but of awareness. Because at that specific point, She was crossing the invisible line that separated safety from the unknown. Some guards positioned near the columns noticed her presence first, and their eyes silently followed her every step toward the center of the hall. The movement caught the attention of other men who were near the throne, and little by little, the murmur of conversations faded as the queen's figure advanced through the space where only guests were expected. Esther's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained serene, like someone who had decided not to let fear alter the outward appearance of what had already been resolved within her soul. The fabric of her garments reflected the light of the hall, and when the crown on her head reminded everyone that this woman was not just another unexpected presence in that place. She was the queen. Even so, the rule remained the same. Approaching the king without being summoned was a direct violation of the law. When Ahasuerus finally noticed her presence, the hall was already completely silent. The men who had been conversing near the steps to the throne instinctively moved a few paces back, creating an empty space between Esther and where the king was seated. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The king's gaze rested upon her with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, as if trying to understand what might have led the queen to break such a well-known protocol. The golden scepter remained motionless in her hand, and at that moment, the entire future seemed to depend on a simple gesture that had not yet been made. To an outsider, that silence might have lasted only a few moments. But for Esther, those seconds seemed to stretch time itself. It was the space between life and death. It was the interval where unseen decisions were being weighed within the mind of a man who had enough power to change destinies with a single movement. Then finally, the king's arm moved. Slowly, the golden scepter was extended toward her. And at that instant, air returned to the lungs of everyone in the hall. Because life had been given, and the throne room still held the silent echo of the moment the golden scepter was extended. And although the immediate tension had dissolved in that gesture, something deeper remained suspended in the air. As if all present knew that the queen's unexpected approach had not been merely a casual visit within the routine of the palace. King Ahasuerus observed Esther with growing curiosity, leaning slightly over the throne as the morning light touched the golden details adorning her robes. And the entire room seemed to await the explanation that would inevitably come. The king's voice broke the silence with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the risk that had just been crossed, asking what request had led Esther to break court protocol, and offering something that sounded almost excessive at that moment. Anything she asked for, even half the kingdom, could be granted. That promise was not only generosity, it was also curiosity. Because men accustomed to power rarely resist the impulse to discover what motivates someone to risk their own life to reach them. Esther remained silent for a few seconds before answering, not because she was insecure, but because she knew that some decisions required time to mature within the strategy itself. Her gaze briefly swept across the hall, noticing the advisors near the throne, the guards positioned between the columns, and the discreet movements of servants who pretended not to observe the scene, but who were clearly attentive to every word that would be spoken. Then she spoke. But the request was not what anyone expected. Instead of immediately revealing the reason for her presence, Esther invited the king to a banquet she had prepared that very day, and added that she wished Haman would also be present. The man's name echoed through the hall with particular weight, because Haman was known throughout the empire as someone extremely close to the king, an advisor whose influence had grown rapidly in recent months. Ahasuerus seemed surprised for a moment, but the simplicity of the request made him accept immediately, ordering Haman to be summoned to accompany the queen's invitation. The hall slowly returned to its usual routine as Esther withdrew, leaving behind an atmosphere where many were still trying to understand why someone would risk their own life just to invite the king to a banquet. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, Haman received the summons with a satisfaction he could barely conceal. Pride swelled within him like wildfire. For being personally invited by the queen to a private meeting with the king seemed like a public confirmation of his importance within the empire's structure. For someone who had spent years quietly accumulating power through political corridors and administrative decisions, this gesture seemed like another step on the ladder that brought him even closer to the center of authority. When Haman arrived at the banquet prepared by Esther, the atmosphere was carefully arranged to convey a sense of intimacy and honor. The low tables were covered with fine fabrics, the scent of spices mingled with the aroma of freshly served wine, and oil lamps cast a warm light that softened the walls of the hall reserved for the gathering. The king drank the offered wine and again asked Esther what her true request was, repeating his promise that even half the kingdom could be granted. The question now carried even more intrigue, because this meeting had clearly been carefully planned, and no one there believed that all of this existed only to share a meal. Once again, Esther did something unexpected. She invited the king and Haman to a second banquet the following day, promising that at that moment she would reveal what she truly wished to ask for. The gesture created a curious pause in the conversation, as if the queen herself were guiding the pace of the situation with a patience that few had noticed before. When Haman left the palace that night, his chest swelled with satisfaction. Walking through the streets of Susa, and he carried within him the certainty that his position had become even more elevated before the king and queen. For him, that banquet was not merely an invitation. It was a public confirmation of his importance within the empire. But as pride grew within him, a simple scene near the palace gate continued to deeply trouble his heart. Mordecai was still there, and Mordecai continued to refuse to bow down before him. Haman passed through the gate and saw the man sitting with the same firm posture that had provoked his anger days before. And at that instant, all the pleasure of the banquet seemed to diminish in his mind. For people dominated by pride, a single affront can destroy the pleasure of 100 honors received. That night, as Susa slowly drifted off to sleep under the dark sky, two stories began to unfold in opposite directions. One driven by pride, another one driven by a silent strategy. And curiously, in the book that records these events, the name of God never appears in writing even once. But the events of that night began to suggest that the silence of the sky did not mean absence. Haman walked briskly through the streets of Susa that night, feeling the pleasant weight of his own importance growing within his chest, like a flame fueled by a constant wind. For few things nourish human pride as much as the feeling of being chosen above all others. The invitation to the queen's banquet still echoed in his mind as he crossed the torch-lit streets, imagining how that moment would be discussed among the nobles and advisors of the palace in the days to come. When he finally arrived home, the atmosphere was filled with comfort and the wealth accumulated over the years as he had skillfully navigated the corridors of power. Servants made way for him, and the smell of freshly prepared food still lingered in the air as his wife Zeres and a few close friends gathered to hear the reason for his evident satisfaction. Haman began to speak. He spoke of his wealth, of the number of children he had, of the position he held above all other officials of the empire, and especially of the fact that among all the men of the court, only he had been invited by the queen to participate in that private banquet with the king. The words flowed easily, as if each sentence were further proof of the greatness he believed himself to possess. But at a certain point, his voice changed tone. Because even surrounded by all that, a single image continued to disturb his thoughts. Mordecai. Haman described the encounter at the palace gate, how the man remained seated without bowing as he passed. and the feeling of disrespect that this provoked within him. Haman's face began to harden as he spoke, and the satisfaction that had marked his arrival began to turn into something more bitter. To an outside observer, it might seem strange that someone with so much power would allow a single act of disobedience to destroy their inner peace. But pride has a cruel characteristic. The greater it becomes, the less the capacity to tolerate any opposition. Haman's wife listened silently before answering. She suggested something that seemed simple, straightforward, so almost practical within the logic of that world dominated by imperial authority. If Mordecai was the problem preventing Haman from fully enjoying his position, then the solution would be to eliminate the problem once and for all. Build a gallows, a structure tall enough to be seen from afar, and in the morning ask the king for permission to execute Mordecai in front of everyone. After that, go to the queen's banquet with a light heart, free from the anger that man has caused. The idea fell into Haman's mind as a perfect answer to his frustration. He immediately ordered his servants to begin preparing the necessary wood, and during the night, a large structure began to be erected in the courtyard near his house. Hammers pounded against the wood while the city slept, and the dry sound of the tools echoed in the cold morning air. The force was growing rapidly. She was tall enough that anyone passing by on the nearby streets could see it when the sun rose. And meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Mordecai continued to live the same night that had begun days before, still dressed in mourning clothes, still carrying the weight of a decree that threatened to erase the existence of his people. He didn't know what was being built at that moment in Haman's house, and perhaps it was better that way, because some threats are too heavy to bear before their time. But that same night, something curious happened inside the palace. King Ahasuerus couldn't sleep. The royal chamber was silent, illuminated only by the steady flame of a few oil lamps fastened to the walls, and yet sleep seemed to refuse to come. The king tossed and turned several times in bed, trying to find comfort in his body's position. But his mind remained restless, as if some forgotten detail were trying to emerge from his memory. Then he ordered that the records from the chronicles of the kingdom be brought in. Those scrolls contained accounts of important events within the empire, administrative decisions, uncovered conspiracies, acts of loyalty that had preserved the security of the throne. A servant began to read aloud by the light of the lamps while the king listened with distracted attention, like someone waiting for weariness to finally overcome vigil. It was then that a particular passage caught his attention. The text mentioned a man named Mordecai. Years earlier, that man had uncovered a plot against the king's life and had reported the danger to the palace authorities, allowing those responsible to be apprehended before the plan could be carried out. The name was recorded there, preserved between the lines of that ancient parchment. Ahasuerus frowned slightly. He asked the servant who was reading if any reward had been given to this man for his act of loyalty. The servant quickly went through the register again, and he replied that nothing had been done. The king remained silent for a few seconds, because that morning, two things were happening simultaneously inside Susa. A gallows was being built for Mordecai, and the king had just discovered that the same man had saved his life. It was still dawn when the heavy silence of the royal chamber was broken by the soft sound of pages being unrolled by the light of the oil lamps. And the scribe continued reading the ancient records of the kingdom, while King Ahasuerus remained reclining, his gaze fixed on the ornate ceiling, as if each word could finally bring the rest that sleep had refused to offer on that strangely restless night. When Mordecai's name appeared again in the reading, something within the king's memory seemed to slowly reorganize itself, like a forgotten piece finally finding its proper place within a large mosaic. He sat up slightly in bed and asked the scribe to repeat the passage more carefully. And as the words were pronounced again, the image of that ancient episode began to return more clearly to his mind. A man had discovered an assassination plot against the king. This man had alerted the palace, and the danger had been neutralized before the coup could take place. But now a simple question became inevitable. What has been done to honor this man? The scribe ran his fingers over the parchment again, tracing the lines written in dark ink with his fingers, while the lamp's flame flickered slightly beside the low table. After a few moments of silent searching, he answered with straightforward honesty. Nothing had been done. No reward. No public honors. No mention beyond that forgotten record among hundreds of events in the kingdom. The king remained silent for a few moments. It wasn't just a matter of justice. It was also a matter of order within an empire where loyalty needed to be recognized in order to continue existing. A man who saved the king's life and remained unrewarded was a flaw in the very functioning of the court. Ahasuerus then rose from his bed, adjusting his clothes as he walked a few steps across the room, still enveloped in the quiet of the early morning. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten very slowly, announcing that the night was drawing to a close. It was then that he asked the servant another question. Who is in the palace courtyard? The servant went to the opening that overlooked the outside area and quickly observed the movement below, where some people were already beginning to circulate before the official start of palace activities. There was someone there. Haman. He had arrived early that morning. Too early. Haman was waiting for the opportunity to speak to the king and ask for permission to execute Mordecai on the gallows that had been built overnight. But inside the royal chamber, nobody knew that yet. When the servant mentioned Haman's name, the king nodded and ordered him to be summoned immediately. The door opened a few moments later, and Haman entered the room with the confident posture of someone who believed he was about to receive further confirmation of his influence within the empire. And he didn't know that the topic of conversation that morning wouldn't be Mordecai in the way he had imagined. The king observed Haman for a moment before speaking, like someone who carefully formulates a question to test the answer that will follow. Then he asked, "What should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman heard the question, and something inside immediately answered before his mind even had time to reflect carefully. Who else could this man be but himself? And in recent days, he had been invited by the queen to an exclusive banquet, had received the direct attention of the king, and his position within the court seemed more solid than ever. Haman's reply was full of enthusiasm. If the king wishes to honor a man, then that man must wear the royal robes worn by the king himself, ride the horse that the king usually rides, and be led through the streets of the city while one of the most important officials proclaims before everyone that this is the man whom the king has decided to honor. Haman spoke confidently, imagining in his own mind the moment when he would walk the streets of Susa covered in honors before the entire city. When he finished speaking, the king nodded with satisfaction. And then he uttered words that would completely change the course of that morning. "Hurry up. Take the clothes and the horse, and do exactly that with Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the palace gate. Don't fail to fulfill any of the things you suggested." For a moment, time seemed to stand still inside that room. Because at that moment, without knowing it, Haman had planned his own humiliation. Haman remained motionless for a brief moment after hearing those words, as if the meaning of the order had taken a few seconds to pierce through the pride that had occupied his mind all night. The expression on his face changed slowly, and although he had learned over the years to control any reaction before the king, something within him seemed to have been struck with the unexpected force of an unseen blow. The king, however, did not perceive the conflict that had arisen at that moment within the heart of his advisor. For Ahasuerus, this was merely a just decision finally being corrected, a way to honor a man whose loyalty had protected the throne years before. He sat down again naturally while Haman made a brief bow and left the room, carrying with him an order that had become impossible to ignore. Outside, the sun was already beginning to rise over Susa, and the city was slowly awakening to another ordinary day, unaware that something profoundly ironic was about to unfold in its streets. Merchants were organizing their stalls, guards were changing shifts at the palace entrances, and the daily bustle was beginning to fill the paths between the stone houses. Haman walked through the palace corridors with heavier steps than those that had brought him there that morning. Each step seemed to remind him that the plan carefully prepared during the night was now being replaced by something completely different from what he had imagined. The gallows he had ordered built still stood in the courtyard of his house, waiting for the man he believed would set foot there before the end of that day. But now the king's order was different. The palace servants brought the royal robes that Ahasuerus himself used to wear on ceremonial occasions, embroidered fabrics that carried the symbolic weight of imperial authority. They also prepared the royal horse, a strong and well-cared-for animal that was often seen carrying the king through the city streets during important celebrations. Mordecai was summoned. Tihu, as he approached the palace gate, still dressed in the simple mourning clothes he had worn in recent days. He probably did not imagine that he was about to become the center of a scene that no one in that city could have foreseen. The servants placed the royal robes on his shoulders, while Haman watched everything with a rigid silence, like someone carrying out an order while trying to keep hidden the battle raging within his own heart. The horse was brought closer. Mordecai was helped to assemble it. And then Haman took hold of the reins. Walking ahead of the animal through the main streets of Susa, he needed to proclaim aloud the phrase he had suggested a few hours earlier before the king, words that now seemed to carry a completely different weight than he had imagined when he uttered them. This is how one treats the man whom the king wishes to honor. People began to emerge from their houses and shops upon hearing the proclamation echoing through the streets. Some recognized Mordecai, the man who was often seen sitting near the palace gate, and surprise quickly spread among those trying to understand the reason for this sudden honor. Haman continued walking, repeating the proclamation, while the city watched. To an outside observer, the scene might have seemed like just another demonstration of the king's authority, but to those who knew the hidden tensions within the palace, something about that role reversal carried a silent irony that seemed too great to ignore. Because in that very city, on that very morning, there was a gallows prepared for Mordecai, and the man who had planned his death was now publicly conducting his honor. When the tour of the city ended, Mordecai dismounted from his horse and returned to the palace gate, as he always did, but without prolonging the scene or enjoying the attention he had received. The weight of the royal robes was lifted from his shoulders, and daily life seemed to slowly return to its usual course. Haman, however, returned home with his face covered. The pride that had dominated his thoughts the previous night now seemed shattered into pieces difficult to put back together. Upon arriving before his wife and friends, he recounted what had happened, and this time there was no satisfaction in his words. The silence that followed his explanation was heavy. Then someone said something that seemed to carry a deeper insight than anyone had considered up to that point. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, belongs to the Jewish people, you will not be able to defeat him. And while those words were still hanging in the air, messengers from the palace arrived at the door of the house. It was time for the second banquet prepared by Esther. Our evening was beginning to fall over Susa when Haman was led back into the palace. And this time, his steps no longer had the same proud lightness of the previous night. The invitation to the queen's second banquet was still a rare honor within the Persian court. But something within him seemed restless since the public humiliation of that morning, as if an invisible fissure had opened in the confidence that had hitherto sustained his position. The room prepared by Esther was once again illuminated by oil lamps that cast a warm light across the walls draped in fine fabrics. The aroma of wine and spices filled the air, and the low table had been set with the same care as the previous day, creating an atmosphere that seemed too tranquil for the invisible weight that was beginning to accumulate between the three participants. King Ahasuerus seemed to be in a good mood, perhaps still pleased that an old injustice had been righted that morning. He drank the offered wine and turned his attention to Esther with the same curious look he had shown at the first banquet, like someone still waiting to discover the true reason for all the preparations. The question came up again. "What is your request, Queen Esther? Even if it's half the kingdom, it will be granted." For a few moments, Esther remained silent, and in that silence, there was something different from what had existed in the previous encounter. It was no longer just strategy. It was the moment when the truth finally needed to cross the space between her and the power that could save or destroy everything. Her breathing became a little deeper before she answered. "If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, then I ask that my life be spared." And the words fell into the air like a stone thrown into still water. The king frowned immediately, surprised by the unexpected direction of that request, and before he could formulate any questions, Esther continued, "And not just my life, the life of my people." The silence that followed was dense enough that even the sound of the lamp flames could be heard, because at that moment the conversation had ceased to be a social gathering within the palace. She had become a revelation. For we were sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be exterminated. If we had only been sold as slaves, I would have remained silent, for no loss would be great enough to trouble the king. But now our lives are in danger. The king's face changed. The tranquility that marked her expression a few seconds before vanished, replaced by a mixture of surprise and indignation that grew rapidly as Esther's words found space within her understanding. Who would dare to do something like that? Who is this man? Where is the person who had the audacity to plan such a thing? The question escaped his lips with the force of someone who had just realized that an invisible threat had been built within his own kingdom. Esther slowly turned her gaze toward Haman, the opponent, the enemy. This man is wicked. Haman. For a moment, nobody moved. Haman seemed unable to react, as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet the instant his name was spoken. The man who had walked through the streets of Susa that morning, proclaiming Mordecai's honor, now stood exposed before the king as the author of a decree that threatened the queen herself. The king's face turned red. Without saying a word, he abruptly rose from the table and walked out of the hall, crossing the palace garden while trying to control the fury that was growing inside him. Inside the hall, Haman remained alone with Esther. The man who had believed he controlled the fate of thousands now stood before the only person who could fully expose his conspiracy. And for the first time since his rise to power had begun, the pride that had always sustained him vanished. Fear arose in its place. The palace garden was silent as King Ahasuerus emerged from the hall, striding briskly between the columns that opened to the afternoon air. The sound of his sandals on the cobblestones of the path seeming to carry the force of the indignation that now gripped his mind. Esther's revelation had pierced his understanding like a sudden blade. For within his own empire, a decree had been issued that now directly threatened the life of the woman who occupied the throne. As he walked among the carefully trimmed trees of the royal garden, His heavy breathing revealed that the matter was no longer merely political or administrative, but this was personal. Haman's name echoed in his mind, along with the recent memory of everything that had transpired that very day. The honor bestowed upon Mordecai, the ancient record of the conspiracy uncovered years before. And now the revelation that the same man who had received so much trust was also responsible for a decree that threatened to destroy an entire people. Inside the hall, Haman had completely lost the composure he usually maintained before the court. The man who, just days before, had walked through the palace corridors with almost arrogant confidence now seemed smaller in the face of the situation unfolding before him. His eyes were fixed on Esther, trying to find some possibility of reversing the situation that was rapidly slipping out of his control. He knew that the king's return would decide everything. Therefore, he did the only thing that still seemed possible. Haman approached Esther and fell to his knees before her, pleading for her life with the urgency of someone who realized too late that the power he believed he possessed was not enough to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. His words came out quickly, rushed by the anxiety that now dominated his voice. As he stretched out his hands, as if trying to seize the last opportunity before it vanished, Esther remained silent. There was no expression of triumph on his face, nor satisfaction at the downfall of the man who had plotted the destruction of his people. There was only the unwavering calm of someone who had traversed a perilous path, and now watched events unfold beyond his control. Haman leaned even closer, almost resting his body on the spot where Esther was reclining at the low banquet table. The gesture was disordered, impulsive, born of a desperation that no longer allowed him to think clearly. But it was at that exact moment that the king returned to the hall. Ahasuerus stopped at the entrance. The scene before his eyes seemed to confirm the indignation already burning within him. Haman was leaning over the queen in a gesture that, seen from that angle and at that specific moment, seemed an even greater affront than any political conspiracy. The king's voice rang out in the hall. "Does he also intend to attack the queen in front of me, inside the palace itself?" And the sentence had barely ended when some guards who had been waiting outside rushed into the hall. Haman's face turned pale as the men approached, and in that instant, everyone there knew that the fate of that powerful advisor had been sealed. One of the palace officials then spoke. He mentioned something that seemed almost impossible to ignore in that context. The large gallows built in Haman's house, prepared overnight to execute Mordecai, the same man who had saved the king's life years before. The information fell upon the room like another piece of a puzzle that was now coming together before the king's eyes. Ahasuerus' reply was brief. "Hang him on it." The guards led Haman out of the hall, and shortly afterward, the same structure that had been erected for Mordecai's death became the instrument of the downfall of the one who had planned his destruction. When it was all over, silence returned to fill the palace. The king's fury slowly subsided, like a storm that begins to lose strength after expending its energy. But although Haman had been erased from history, the decree he had written still existed. And in Persian law, decrees sealed with the royal ring could not simply be revoked. The threat against Esther's people was still widespread throughout the empire. The silence that remained in the hall after Haman was taken away seemed too heavy for that space where, just hours before, wine and conversation had filled the air, and I can imagine Esther still sitting at the low table while the echoes of the king's decision slowly faded through the palace corridors. Haman's downfall had resolved part of the threat, but it had not removed the weight that still hung over her, people scattered throughout the provinces of the empire. Because Persian decrees did not disappear with the death of the person who wrote them. They remained, sealed with the king's authority, and the decree of destruction still existed. Sometime later, Esther returned to Ahasuerus' presence, and this time, the risk seemed different from the first time she had crossed the hall uninvited. The scepter had already been extended before. The trust between them had been strengthened by the revelation that had exposed Haman's conspiracy. And yet this new request carried a gravity that could not be ignored. When Esther approached the throne, her words did not come with the quiet strategy of the first banquet. Now there was emotion in them, an urgency born from the knowledge that thousands of lives were still bound by the weight of a decree spread throughout the empire. She fell before the king, and he begged. The words came out accompanied by tears that could no longer be contained, because at that moment she was speaking not only as a queen, but as someone who carried within her heart the destiny of her people. The decree written by Haman had been sent to all the provinces, in authorizing the destruction of the Jews on a specific day, and even with Haman dead, the law remained valid. The king listened in silence. Ahasuerus' face seemed torn between two forces: compassion for the woman before him and the rigid reality of Persian law, which did not allow simply erasing a decree sealed with the royal ring. For years, the empire had been governed on the basis of this legal stability, and breaking that rule could have unpredictable consequences for the authority of the throne. But ignoring Esther's request also seemed impossible. So he did something different. Ahasuerus gave Mordecai the ring that had belonged to Haman, the symbol of authority that allowed him to seal official documents in the king's name. Mordecai now occupied the position that had previously been used to plot the destruction of his people. And with this authority, he received permission to write a new decree, a decree that would not cancel the previous one. But that would allow for something unexpected. The Jews could defend themselves. Messengers were sent swiftly along all the empire's routes, riding swift horses that traversed dusty roads, carrying with them the new orders sealed with the king's ring. In every city, in every distant province, the new decree announced that on the appointed day the Jews had the right to assemble and protect their lives against any attack. Inside the palace, Mordecai left the king's presence dressed in royal robes of great honor, with a blue and white cloak that reflected the sunlight as he passed through the gates before the assembled crowd. Those who had wept in the streets days before now began to feel something different growing within their hearts: hope. And in many parts of the empire, as the news spread, the fear that had gripped so many homes slowly began to turn into joy. Because when God's silence seems deepest, sometimes that's precisely where the story begins to move. News of the new decree began to travel the roads of the empire like wind across dry fields, carried by messengers who rode day and night on swift animals trained for long distances. Dust rose behind them as they crossed bridges, deserts, and small towns scattered throughout the provinces of Persia, and carrying in their leather pouches the scrolls sealed with the royal ring. And in each place where they stopped to announce the message, a silent change began to take place within the houses where fear had settled days before. For weeks, Jewish families had lived under the weight of an inevitable sentence, waiting for a day marked on the calendar, like someone watching a storm approaching on the horizon without sufficient shelter to protect themselves. Now, however, the new order allowed something that until then seemed impossible. They could gather, organize themselves, and defend their own lives against any attack launched against them. Inside the palace, Mordecai gradually began to assume the responsibilities that had previously belonged to Haman. And those who circulated through the court corridors began to notice the difference in how each occupied that position. The power that had once been used to fuel pride and revenge now seemed burdened with a different weight, as if each decision made constantly reminded him that true authority demands responsibility towards the lives that may be affected by it. When the appointed day finally arrived, many cities of the empire were prepared for something no one had foreseen: when the first decree was sent. Instead of finding a scattered and defenseless people, those who intended to execute the ancient order discovered that the Jews were gathered, organized, and determined to protect their families. Conflicts occurred in various regions, and although the tensions of that day were real, something curious began to repeat itself in the more distant provinces of the empire. In many places, people who had previously been afraid to associate with the Jews began to approach them, realizing that history had taken an unexpected turn since Mordecai's name became known within the kingdom's administration. Susa, the capital, experienced that moment with even greater intensity. For 2 days, the city remained on alert, and the streets, normally filled with commerce and conversation, began to carry a different kind of tension as each group carefully observed the events around them. But at the end of that period, when the danger finally passed and silence returned to the city gates, something new began to emerge among the people. Relief, then joy, and finally, celebration. Because what had begun as a decree of destruction had been transformed into a moment of unexpected liberation. Mordecai recorded these events and sent messages to Jewish communities throughout the empire, establishing that those days should be remembered every year as a time of celebration, gratitude, and remembrance. This celebration has been given a name, Purim, a curious name because it came from the word used to describe the lotteries Haman had conducted when casting lots to choose the day of the destruction of the Jewish people. What had been used as an instrument of threat now became a symbol of remembrance, a testament to the fact that human decisions may seem definitive for a moment, but history does not always end the way power imagines. And perhaps that is one of the most intriguing details of this entire account. Throughout all these events, the name of God does not appear even once in the records of the Book of Esther. No long prayers were recorded, no supernatural intervention was described. The story seems to unfold solely through human decisions, seemingly ordinary encounters, sleepless nights, and silent choices made by people who didn't know exactly how it would all end. And yet, when we look back, the sequence of these events forms something that seems much bigger than coincidence. As if, even in the silence, something were guiding every step of the story. The city of Susa slowly returned to its normal rhythm after those intense days. But something had changed within the people who witnessed those events. The streets that had once carried murmurs of fear were now filled with conversations that recalled how it had all begun, with a decree that seemed impossible to avoid and ended with a reversal that no one would have dared to imagine. When the first copies of that document reached the people's hands, Mordecai continued to pass through the palace gate. But now his presence carried a quiet authority that came not only from his position at court, but also from the vivid memory of what had happened. Many who walked those streets knew that, at some point, the story of their own families had been dangerously close to its end. Esther also continued to live within the palace, surrounded by the same stone walls, the same corridors lit by oil lamps, and the same silent rules that governed court life. At first glance, her life seemed to have returned to the same place as before. But some experiences change a person in ways that make it impossible to return to exactly where it all began. She knew now that the position that had once seemed merely a circumstance of life had revealed itself to be something much greater. The throne, the royal robes, the palace corridors. All of that had become the setting for a decision that demanded silent courage at a time when no one else could act in her place. And perhaps that is precisely why the story of Esther continues to be remembered centuries later, because she speaks of a type of moment that we all encounter at some point in our lives, on a moments when the safest path seems to remain silent. There are times when prudence suggests waiting a little longer, moments when life itself seems too small in the face of the risk that lies before us. And yet, there is that silent question that arises in the heart. What if you are exactly where you need to be? Not because he sought out that place, but because he was led to him. The Book of Esther ends without recording a visible miracle, without describing a sea parting or fire descending from the sky. Instead, it leaves something different before us. A sequence of seemingly ordinary events that, when viewed together, reveal an invisible direction guiding the story. One night the king couldn't sleep. An old record read at the exact moment, a banquet that looked like just a meal. A decision made by someone who chose courage when fear would have been the easier choice. Oh, and perhaps that's how many of the most important things happen. God doesn't always speak aloud. Sometimes he works in the silence of circumstances, guiding events that seem ordinary until, looking back, we realize that every detail was moving towards something greater. If this reflection has accompanied you this far, leave your sign of support and join us on this journey that continues to explore the stories that the Bible holds. And if you want to mark this moment in the comments, just write these words: I choose courage. Because sometimes a silent decision is exactly what changes the course of an entire story.